So the goals of cross-examination, there's two different goals because you obviously have two different roles. So one, if you're asking the questions, it's to poke holes in your opponent's case. So looking for places that you can point out weaknesses, things that they said that you know are incorrect or you have information to counter. And of course, if you're answering questions, then bringing up new information, working to add more to your case or defend your case. So what you want to ask yourself, do you have information to counter this? Is there a disadvantage to the plan they're proposing? Are they misrepresenting facts, or do you have something to counter it? Or is their logic flawed? So in that case, that is where you would ask a question. So the format of the debate. Just a reminder, pro goes first, 6 to 8 minutes. Con then cross-examines pro for 1 to 2 minutes. Keep in mind, only con will be asking the questions and only pro should be answering them. Then con does their speech and then pro. And just like I said before, cross-examination, in this particular point, only pro would be asking the questions and only con would be answering them. So this is an example of what the debate would look like. Notice right now we have one person speaking. That would be pro. Remember, 6 to 8 minutes for the speech. You saw a second ago her opponent sitting next to her taking notes. So that's what you want to do if you are the person who is not speaking. You want to be taking notes on what your opponent says so that you'll actually be able to come up with some questions. Like I said before, you can pre-prepare some of your questions, but I would really like it if you also came up with questions based on what your opponent said. So once she has finished speaking, this is pro still, remember the cross-examination is going to start. So you'll see in a second, once she finishes, her opponent is going to come up and start cross-examining her. Now, one thing to notice too here is when they do stand up to cross-examine each other, so notice here, Con is coming up, he will cross-examine her. Now, look, they are actually not going to be facing each other. This is a debate formality. He just actually started a timer because he's timing himself. Remember, you only have 2 minutes. That's not a lot of time. So once they finish their cross-examination, pro will sit down and then con will actually start his speech. All right, so now they've finished their cross-examination. So pro will sit down. She's now going to switch roles as far as taking notes, and then con will come up and start his speech. He then also has 6 to 8 minutes to defend his side of the position. So remember, he's arguing against the change. And then once his speech finishes, pro will then get a chance to cross-examine the opponent. So his speech is now wrapping up. Once he finishes, you will see her come up and we'll see cross-examination. Like I said before, when you cross-examine your opponent, you're actually not going to be looking at them. You will stand right by each other. So when your opponent is speaking, you sit down and take notes, and then once you actually come up, you will both be standing for cross-examination and you will face out to the audience. I know this seems really weird, but this is a debate format. This is the tradition. The reason being is because the argument is not about each other. It's not about your opponent. It's about proving to your audience that you have the best argument. And of course, it's not personal, so you don't need to actually look at them. So notice, not looking at each other, facing out to the audience. Once they finish, that would be the end of the debate. Now what you're going to see in a second is an example of a short segment of cross-examination. So the topic is actually going to be about roundabouts are better than traffic lights. This is coming from the Toronto Debate Society, excuse me. The speaker is going to be arguing for roundabouts, so he's going to be finishing his case, and then we'll see someone come up and cross-examine him, and they are arguing for traffic lights. Probably right now you're thinking, what the heck are roundabouts? They are these. So the person who is talking is going to be arguing that these are better than having traditional stoplights, right? The traffic lights that we typically have. So this is the debate example. I'm going to be starting it in a second. I've paused the video right now. The person you're looking at is actually the moderator of the debate. She's going to start by introducing the topic and talking a little bit about what people give points for as far as good cross-examination. And that's what you want to pay attention to. If she says prime minister, she means pro, or the person that's for the government or the change. Opposition, of course, means con. So just keep that in mind. Look for what the speakers are doing well and what they could improve on, because there are definitely some flaws in this particular example. And I'll also be putting some tips on, but you do want to pay attention to both what each can improve on for this particular segment. We're going to be watching the tail end of the speaker finishing his speech. It's the last minute, and then we'll see the cross-examination happen. That's the only segment that we'll be watching. Remember, there are 2 cross-examinations that actually do happen in the debate.
8 questions based on that. We're going to preview, we're going to show you an example of this style of debate on the motion. Be it resolved that roundabouts are better than traffic lights. The debate is already in progress. We're going to tune into the closing minute of the Prime Minister's speech.
Okay, so I realize I'm almost out of time, so I'll use my last minute to quickly cover my third and final point. As traffic circles do not require any type of illuminated signals, it will no longer be required to install them at all. This will save money on the cost and installation and repair, as well as the cost of the energy required to continuously illuminate these signals 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Further, these signals are susceptible to damage and power outages caused by storms or any other numbers of problems. Without these signals, we are free for the architecture of a roundabout to regulate itself for free. My honourable colleague will expand upon this and other of my key arguments. In summary, the government's 3 main points are: 1, that roundabouts offer 40% fewer vehicle collisions, 80% fewer injuries, and 90% fewer serious injuries and fatalities. 2, these superior designs are already installed in widespread use in major European cities. And 3, illuminated signals are not required. Please support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. To cross-examine the Prime Minister for 2 minutes, followed by 5 minutes of his own presentation, please welcome the Leader of the Opposition, Jerry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Prime Minister, I have a few questions for you. Firstly, are you aware that your second point is a logical fallacy?
Well, actually...
Excuse me, wait, let me finish my statement here. As a logical fallacy is defined, you appealed to popularity or the fact that many people do something. In this case, many people use roundabouts. Just because many people use roundabouts, that does not make it a valid point, sir.
That actually seemed to be a bit more of a statement than a question, but I will say that you can call it whatever you like. However, it is the contention of the government that since these superior designs are already in widespread use in many major...
No, stop. As for your third point, you spoke about the cost saved by no longer being required to install traffic signals. Have you considered the immense cost involved in transforming the hundreds of thousands of traffic lights in Canada? How is your cost argument for cost benefits reasonable if you do not consider the refurbishment as part of the costs?
I would remind the Honourable Leader of the Opposition that tonight's resolution states that roundabouts are better than traffic lights, which means that it is not our burden to prove the fact that the implementation of traffic lights would be better. It is an inherent fact that the roundabouts themselves do not need to be powered. Therefore, they are better in this attribute.
Really? Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I somewhat doubt your statements, but we'll get to that later. I shall now rebut some of your arguments, and then I will give you some of my own statements, none of which I have, so I'm not going any further.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So I'd like to point out a couple of points. One is Jerry's long-winded questions. Long-winded questions. So if you consider that you have 2 minutes to ask questions when you're up here, if you can take up 1 minute and 30 in asking questions, that does not give Dave very much time. And in asking the questions, Jerry was actually proving his point. So he did have a couple of questions in one question, which is probably not the best way of doing it, but in his second point, have you considered the immense cost involved in transforming the hundreds of thousands of traffic lights? It puts the seed in the adjudicator's mind and into the mind of the audience is that, oh my goodness, we've got lots of traffic lights in Canada. How much is it going to cost to retrofit? How are roundabouts possibly better than that? Just puts that element of, oh, what if, or causes doubt, raises some doubt onto the Prime Minister's argument. So there were long-winded arguments, questions, but he also cut off the Prime Minister. He cut off Dave twice when Dave was trying to answer. So in doing that, that's another strategical tactic that you can use. Because if they're going to start to prove their point and not prove your point, you want to cut them off and move on to the next. It's not always fair, but nothing's fair in love and debating and war. And I do encourage you to give it a shot because it is a fun debating style. Now we can applaud. Thank you.
The next thing you need to consider to be really effective in cross-examination is the secret goal. Basically, what the secret goal is, what do you want to achieve by asking questions? Many times students just kind of haphazardly go into cross-examination without having a clear goal. And without a goal, you don't really have a purpose or a focus. And a lot of times students will get lost in cross-examination. So it's important to have a secret goal. So some examples, right? I want them, by them, of course, I mean your opponent, to admit there's some risk in their idea because it's never been tried before, right? That could be something if you have a solution that's being proposed that hasn't been tried. I want them to admit they have no evidence to prove their second point, or maybe there's a weakness in their evidence. I want them to see that their solution will hurt certain groups. So all of these are examples, but these are specific things that you want to achieve. And then what you want to do is create questions that then achieve that goal. So if you have this, you really need to address what are the weaknesses in my opponent's case. You can't only think about the strengths of your case. You need to focus on the weaknesses of the opponent's case. Now, you somewhat did this in the counter-argument and rebuttal by thinking about, well, what would they be attacking me with? This is also kind of trying to do that because you have to challenge what they're saying. So again, you have to think of both sides of the argument. This is going to strengthen not only the case that you make for your speech, but also for cross-examination. So write down your secret goal. This will give you a broad focus, and then what you want to do is have all of your questions relate to this. Now I'm saying write this down as though it's just one thing. Your secret goal could be multiple things, and it may actually come up as you hear your opponent's speech, right? You may hear, oh, that's a weakness. Okay, I really want them to admit, that what they said here was not true, or that, they're not recognizing this part of the argument. So really have something going into the debate, but you can also maybe come up with a few others afterwards. All right, to give you an example, so these two might look familiar because I just showed them a second ago for the format of the debate, but I also actually want to show you their debate with the audio so that you can see what they're doing. So the topic that they're arguing is violent force justifiable to overthrow oppressive regimes or governments, right? So if you have a government that is oppressive, can you, in fact, or should you, use violence to do that? Now, she is going to be the cross-examinator, and she is going to be saying, yes, it is justified. We should use violence. So keep in mind then that the person that she is arguing against is going to be arguing, no, violence is not justified. You can't use it. So her goal is to get him to admit that there are situations where there are, violence that can be considered permissible. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because you're not going to see his speech, but he does try to sort of make a distinction that there are situations where it's considered permissible but not justified. He tries to make a distinction between those two words, and that's really her goal going in. So let's watch what happens and see if she actually does achieve that goal.
Okay, so against the affirmative case, you talk about Florida as an example of political oppression. And you agree that the resolution is a question of on balance, general principles, right?
I understand that you're going to make the argument that this is one example. My argument, however, is that nowhere in the affirmative case do you prove that political oppression always, or on balance, has to be violent.
Okay, but just answer my question, please. So would you say Florida is the norm for political oppression?
No, but I also would say that The
So it's
political
not the
oppression.
norm for political oppression?
Can I answer the question?
Sure.
Okay. I would say that the cases of political oppression that you cite in your case are not the norm for political oppression. So likewise, if you're going to reject my example of what political oppression is, we ought to reject yours as well because it's also one-sided.
Okay. Now let's go to the negative case. You talk about the idea that if there's unnecessary suffering involved, that's unjust.
Right.
Okay, but let's say a lifeguard on duty sees a child drowning in the ocean or the pool or wherever they may be.
Okay.
And tries to save that child's life. Perhaps the lifeguard fails, but was the attempt to try and save that life unjust?
I don't see how any unnecessary suffering was created there.
Well, I just want to know, would that be unjust?
Trying to help people is a good thing, Tharni.
So that's just.
It's a good thing, yes, it's just, but I don't
Okay.
see why that creates unnecessary suffering.
Okay, and now your criterion is the prevention of unnecessary suffering.
Right.
So necessary suffering then is just.
No, it's permissible. That's the argument I made against the affirmative case, and it's also in the
But
negative
in
case.
your own criterial analysis, which has to have a connection to justice, you talk about unnecessary versus necessity.
Tharni,
So if you're
justice is
preventing-
not a binary. If something is unnecessary, that doesn't make it necessary. It could also be permissible. I spent a lot of time against the affirmative case explaining why that's
So
true.
then why, if something is unnecessary, is that unjust?
Because it's creating unnecessary suffering.
That was simply a repetition of my question. My question
No, it's
is,
the answer to your question, because
No.
there's never necessary suffering. If it's unnecessary suffering, it's unjust. If it's necessary suffering, it's permissible.
why?
I explained that we have this general norm that killing is wrong. We never say that killing is justified. We say that killing is permissible in certain situations, which is what you bring up in your case, in
So
terms
we
of
would say
self-defense.
that an act of self-defense is simply permissible, it is not just.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to tell my kids that killing is justified.
So when somebody is assaulted on the street and is protecting their life, they are unjust in doing so.
No, they are committing a permissible act.
Sure, but you're saying that permissibility is different from justice.
But that
And if
doesn't make it-
something is
that doesn't make it
permissible,
injustice.
That would be unjust.
That doesn't make it injustice. We can call it ajust.
In terms
Dude, guys, language is fluid. I can make up whatever.
okay, so then what are the necessary conditions for justice?
I don't know what the necessary conditions are. My argument is that you're not meeting the condition that if you're creating unnecessary suffering, it's unjustified. I have to negate the resolution.
So, did she achieve her goal? I would argue yes, right? She ultimately got her opponent to admit the whole, when he was trying to make up a word, didn't really work for his case. But notice she kept going. She had a really clear focus and a clear goal, and that's very important to get. Also, in the beginning of the debate, she really didn't get the answer that she wanted when she was talking about Florida, right? She asked about it. He kind of didn't really answer the question. She asked again, and then she moved on. That's also important to keep in mind. You don't want to continue to just keep asking and asking and asking. She definitely had a long line of questions for the second part, but that was because her secret goal here was so important, right? She had to get him to admit that violence can in fact be considered justifiable. There are situations that just saying it's permissible is essentially the same thing as saying it's justifiable. The two words are really alike. So by doing that and having that focus, that really helped her debate and really was what hurt his case. So keep that in mind, that you want to have a cross-examination secret goal, at least one, if not more, so that you have a clear focus and know where you're going when you start asking questions.